Thank you so much for having me in this panel. I have three essential points that I think are natural extensions to what have been discussed earlier. First of all, I'm actually, as a young person, I'm very concerned about the misinformation that this war has produced, right? While a physical war is taking place in Ukraine, I think there's also a concurrent war that's taking place in virtual space, and that is the war on information. I think both parties, both Ukraine as well as Russia, are trying to see if they can actually get a hold on the narrative, right? Because again, who controls information also controls the mind. So I think there is an element of misinformation that also sort of distorts people's perspective and understanding of what actually is going on the ground. And more importantly, there's also been attempts to use deep fakes, as we have seen how Russia has tapped on, to ensure that it actually gets a hold on how other people perceive on what's going on the ground. Secondly, I think this crisis has also reminded us that the global economy is indeed very fragile and is susceptible to supply shocks, especially when events such as a war takes place. So I think for us, it's actually very distressing to see how, risk events can take place concurrently, and also in a very short span of time, things can go down. And I think as earlier a speaker alluded to how it actually affects the global south, I think that's something that countries are looking out for, and looking at how that will affect poverty and, more importantly, food security in the global south. The last point I would like to make is that I feel, as a young person, I feel very underwhelmed. Why? Mainly because of how big powers such as India as well as China has responded, right? I think if we have all been looking at how it responded to the vote, right, both of the countries actually abstained. So I'd like to direct a question to Mr. Kishore, given his understanding of global power and, more importantly, his study of China and the US. I would like to ask if he actually sees an opportunity for big powers such as China and even India to step up and broker peace in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Fayyaz. Kishore.
Well, I would say that's a very difficult question. And it's very hard to give. Let me be brutally frank, okay? All great powers, without exception, put their national interests first. The idea that any great power is benevolent is an oxymoron. And the one constant lesson of history, which is 2,000 years old, is that there are no exceptions. Great powers will put their interests first. Great powers will sacrifice the interests of other countries if they get in the way of their own interests. So that's a fundamental rule of history, which is an iron law of history, and it's important for us to come from small states to understand that. So to answer your question, China and India are putting their national interests first. In the case of China, China is now engaged in a monumental struggle with the United States. And this geopolitical contest has begun, will carry on for the next decade or two. And China will do whatever it takes to protect itself in this contest against the United States. And China knows that if Russia collapses completely as a great power, then China will be left standing alone to deal with the United States. That will be an enormous loss for China. And by the way, this Ukraine war has already led to 4 or 5 major setbacks for China already, because just as Angela was describing how in many ways Putin didn't understand what he was getting into in Ukraine. He made serious mistakes in Ukraine. I think in the same way, China has also been hit very badly in several different ways by this contest too. So that's why it is logical behavior as a great power to protect its interests by continuing its collaboration with Russia. Now, India's considerations are different because India is not engaged in a geopolitical contest against the United States. In fact, India is emerging as a new ally of the United States. And in fact, until Ukraine happened, the relationship between India and the US was getting closer day by day. But at the same time, the Indians are, like China, equally alarmed at the prospect of Russia collapsing because they rely on Russia in many critical areas. First is that 55% of Indian armaments come from Russia. And therefore, they need Russia as an arms supplier. Number two, India has had many episodes in the UN Security Council when it could have faced resolutions that would have, in one way or another, condemned India for what India did, let's say in Kashmir or whatever it is, right? The one power that has consistently vetoed anti-India resolutions or blocked anti-India resolutions in the UN Security Council has been Russia. And so the Indians remember this, and so to protect their own interests, they will not join in the sanctions on Russia. In fact, as you know, India is actually now doing the opposite. India is actually setting up a rupee ruble account to ensure that it can keep on trading with Russia and bypass the US dollar sanctions that have been put on that. And in India's position on this is very strong. The under a US law, I forget what it's called now, there's a law that will sanction India for accepting the S-400 missiles from Russia. But India will proceed with getting those missiles despite the sanctions that US will put on India. So the short answer to your question is that geopolitics is a cruel business, and great powers will put their own interests ahead of any other considerations, including humanitarian considerations.
So just to make clear, you are merely stating your understanding or your reading of their considerations. You're not, it doesn't suggest whether you agree with those considerations or not. Yes?
I absolutely not. But at the same time, I think it's important for us, if you want to understand the outcomes in international relations, you have to be like a scientist, a clinical scientist. And if something that is happening is terrible, you want to know what's happening, even though it's terrible, then you can anticipate the consequences that flow from it.